Trans Mountain project has soared to $12.6 billion, a significant increase from the initial estimate of $7.4 billion. That sticker shock has renewed calls to abandon the taxpayer-owned pipeline's expansion. For more on this, we're joined by Wilderness Committee campaigner Peter McCartney. Good morning, Peter. Thanks for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So with the amount of money that's already been spent on this pipeline, do you see the government actually backing down?
You know, there's two things that are interesting about this. No company in the world looks at sunk costs when they're determining whether or not to keep going with the project. And no company in the world is accountable to the Canadian public. And we've seen opposition to this pipeline jump 11 points since the government bought it. And we think that's only going to continue as Canadians realize what a money pit this is going to be. So we do think that Prime Minister Trudeau will back down at one point.
Even with the announcement of this significant increase in the cost of the project, it seems like the government is still pushing forward with this. What's your reaction to seeing that?
I mean, it's disturbing, to be honest. They're putting up figures that are using, they're using the earnings before all the interest and taxes we're paying on this. And so they really make it look like this pipeline is still going to be economically viable, but that's just not true. And Minister Morneau wouldn't give an answer to how high this had to get before his government would abandon it, which makes me wonder, what exactly are they looking at behind the scenes?
So if the government were to drop this project, how would you suggest spending the money?
I mean, $16 billion is just such an incredible amount of money, and we should be using it to fight climate change instead of making it worse. That could fund major transit expansions in every city across the country. It could fund renewable energy projects in rural areas, and solve the homelessness crisis that we have going on. So there's a lot better ways to create jobs and prosperity and an economy that will actually last than buying a pipeline for an industry that maybe has a few years left in it.
Of course, if this project were dropped, there's a lot of concern, especially from our neighbors in Alberta, about future investments, that companies just simply will not even consider Canada as an option. What do you say to those concerns?
I don't think they're considering Canada now. This pipeline isn't going to change that. The truth is the tar sands aren't economic in a world that is paying $50 or less for a barrel of oil. And nothing a pipeline is going to do. It's become the symbol of the savior of Alberta. But we've seen the Tech Frontier Mines CEO saying, we don't have the price to be able to make this thing work. That's the largest tar sands mine ever proposed in Alberta. So, I think what Albertans want is jobs and prosperity. And we have $16 billion at our disposal, apparently, to make that happen. But let's do it with clean energy and moving forward for an economy that will actually last for that province.
Now, when John Horgan recently conceded, saying he had used all the tools in his toolbox to try and fight this expansion, you said, okay, John Horgan, we'll do it without you. What's next? What does that mean?
Well, we're pushing and trying to get the Canadian public aware of the collapsing business case for this project. There's still a lot of legal avenues available to the First Nations and environmental groups who are fighting this project in the courts. And I don't think it's any secret that communities all along the pipeline route are ready to stand in its way. You saw that with the court decision this past week. People stood up and said, we're going to stop this thing. We've always said whatever it takes. And so we'll be working very closely with communities on the ground to make sure that they know what's going on in their backyards as this pipeline potentially starts construction.
Give us an idea of what that could look like, though, because we have seen a number of appeals fail. We have seen court ruling in favor of this expansion, and we have now seen our own premier, who said he'd fight to the very end to try and stop this expansion, now say, I can't. I've exhausted every option to do so. So what might that look like? You say that you will try and stop this at any cost. How?
Well, the Supreme Court of Canada could rule in favor of the First Nations. This ruling that they had last week was a very narrow scope, and so they've already appealed the scope of that project. And then the other way, I think, is just showing Canadians that the costs of this thing are only going to keep rising as permitting delays, route changes, legal errors, and community resistance all drive the project more and more expensive. And, I think we're in a climate emergency now. As the world is experiencing wildfires and floods battering our communities, it's only getting more and more obvious that we cannot keep expanding tar sands infrastructure, and the case for the project falls apart more and more every day.
Wilderness Committee campaigner Peter McCartney, thank you so much for coming in.
Hey, thank you for having me.